we see that the debt continues to grow at an insane pace, as well as the costs of servicing it, which have already exceeded 1/1900 trillion a year. And this is becoming a serious problem because, for example, this year the US Treasury has to issue debt obligations for almost $9.2 trillion. And this, of course, will lead to additional financial burdens given that interest rates have increased significantly since this debt was taken out. Naturally, both Trump and enrages are starting to panic, especially given the decision of the US Federal Reserve to leave the interest rate unchanged. The fact is that the Federal Reserve believes that the risks of unemployment and inflation have increased and therefore, it is not worth rushing to lower rates. Naturally, this is not what Trump wants. However, on the other hand, the decision of the US Federal Reserve added confidence to investors that the economy is stable, which led to a rebound in the markets, including Bitcoin. However, do not believe the words of the US federal system. It is better to look at its actions. And in this video, I want to do exactly that. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the global panic that is forcing the world's largest economy to secretly save markets from collapse. What the US Federal Reserve is doing, which is still lying in public speeches, may be a harbinger of a real QE and in large volume, which may happen within the next few months. There are some historical precedents in favor of this. To begin with, let's look at some of the headlines to understand the situation we are in. The world is sliding into even more chaos, and that is why gold and even Bitcoin have been shining lately. So, India has launched military strikes against Pakistan, the Financial Times reports. Yes, it is very disturbing. It is connected with the Kashmir region, which is now under the control of India. These two countries have nuclear weapons, which causes even more fear and conspiracy theories. For example, that China did it because Apple and other companies announced the transfer of production from China to India. As for me, it doesn't sound like much. Some say that the escalation between India and Pakistan, which may occur in the future, will become a new black swan that will bring down markets, including Bitcoin. Of course, the world is also speculating about a possible attack against Iran by the United States, and, finally, the Third World War, in which a direct military clash will begin between China and the United States. I also see that a new German chancellor was elected yesterday, but for this he had to go through 2 votes. In the first vote, he suffered a historic defeat. This shows that something is clearly wrong in the political climate in Germany right now. It is important to note that Germany has always been an example of political stability after the Second World War, and its political processes after 1945 year have traditionally been quite predictable. For Germany, political stability has always been the most important indicator, and such changes in it may cause concern, not only within the country, but also in international relations. Now Germany has become extremely unstable in this regard, because this is the first time since the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany after World War II, when the Chancellor needed 2 votes to be elected. Usually the election of the Chancellor, it's just a formality. But for the first time in the first vote, he didn't get enough votes. This is not obvious to many, but I think it is a symptom of a crisis of confidence and even a symptom of a currency collapse. In one of the once most stable countries in Europe, gold is traditionally a safe asset in times of inflation and economic shifts. And Bitcoin can serve as a protection against the depreciation of national currencies. And there is no need to go far for an example. Just look at those countries whose national currencies are falling heavily against the dollar, and see how Bitcoin has grown strongly against them. The most important news. In yesterday's video, I said that China's economy is also feeling the impact of the tariff war. And we can see from their actions that this is so. China is already taking measures aimed at stimulating the economy, markets, and improving trade. They are literally starting to stimulate the economy, which is similar to what the United States of America did during the coronavirus. Here's what Bloomberg says. China is lowering its key interest rate and reserve rate to support an economy that has been hit by tariffs. Look, the People's Bank of China has lowered the rate on weekly reverse repo of 1.5% to 0.4%. Thus, commercial banks will receive a cheaper source of liquidity, which will eventually increase liquidity in the entire economy. They are also going to reduce the reserve ratio of banks by 0.5%. This is the norm that banks must necessarily keep in their reserves. Lowering this rate will also increase liquidity in the economy, which will stimulate economic growth and asset growth in the economy. The Chinese also say that they can start trade negotiations with the United States of America. This is a positive signal for the markets. A signal that China has suddenly changed its mind about fighting to the end and wants to resolve this issue. In addition, President Trump announced the first deal they have reached, and this is a comprehensive and complete deal with the UK. This is also a plus. And Bitcoin reacts positively. In addition, Chinese stock markets rose slightly. Chinese investors are also positive about the changes. And the yield on 10-year government bonds also rose by 1 basis point. Perhaps the movement of gold over the past 2 days was also associated with these events. But while China is directly talking about saving markets and the economy, the US Federal Reserve is doing it behind the scenes. And secretly. While people are distracted by the US Federal Reserve's statements that the interest rate will not be lowered, people do not notice what is happening behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, what is happening is what some sarcastically call non-QE operations, that is, operations that are not related to quantitative easing. As we can see, the Federal Reserve System has been engaged in quantitative tightening since the middle of 2022 year. Since then, the balance of their assets has only been falling, that is, they are selling and selling them. And this is a big difference for altcoins in this cycle and in the past. Pay attention to the total market capitalization of cryptocurrencies excluding Bitcoin. In other words, this is the capitalization of Ether and all other altcoins. That's the situation we're in. Here is the current cycle against the background of the infinitely falling balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve. But the previous cycle, we saw a huge increase from March 2000 of the 20th year to approximately April 2000 of the 22nd year. What happened to the US Federal Reserve's asset balance then? Here is March of the 2020th year at this point, and here is April of the 2022nd year. Just during this entire period, the US Federal Reserve was engaged in quantitative easing, buying assets, increasing the balance sheet. And here is the impact of these actions on alt bitcoins. Naturally, with such a falling chart of the RSA asset balance, we cannot see such an explosion of alt bitcoins. It will happen only when this chart unfolds. And then altcoins will amaze many, but not all, because there are too many of them. So choose them wisely. The US Federal Reserve is still conducting quantitative tightening, but sooner or later it should stop. And perhaps it will happen after 6 months, that is, already sometime in the fall of this year. Let's see. But I think that the US Federal Reserve will have to intervene at least in the same bond market and start buying them back, which should lead to a reversal of this schedule, that is, to the beginning of growth of their balance sheet. Look, this has already happened in the past. Even the same term was used in the speeches of the US Federal Reserve. In September 2000 of the 19th year, this is this moment on the chart. There was a crisis of confidence on Wall Street. It was called the repo crisis. What happened then? Banks simply stopped lending each other money overnight, even secured by US Treasury bonds. This is a very alarming signal. If you don't even trust US bonds, then you don't trust anyone at all. Because of this, the repo rate sharply and unexpectedly soared from 2 to 10%, literally in a day. Repo rate. This is the percentage at which banks give each other money for a very short period of time, for example, overnight. If the repo rate soars sharply, it is a direct signal that banks are afraid to give each other money, even under reliable collateral like US bonds. And as a result, liquidity in the markets and in the system disappeared. The market was on the verge. It was about here. And that's when, as you can see, the US Federal Reserve intervened. That's the growth. However, she didn't call it a QE operation. Here is an article in Bloomberg from September 23, 2019. The US Federal Reserve corrects the repo market, but does not call it QE. In other words, this is not a QE operation according to them, although in fact, it was a QE. It was quantitative easing. But they said then, no, we don't print money. And the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve said the opposite. It started to grow from $3.7 trillion to $4.2 trillion in just a few months. And then in the 2020th year, there was a real explosion of the printing press here. Plus $3 trillion from March to June, and another $3 trillion until the spring of 2022 year. It was massive quantitative easing at the full height of its powers. And it all started with the statement here, in September 2019, that this is not Q, this is not quantitative easing. Do you catch the lie? And today everything repeats itself. The Fed enters the market again, buys bonds again, and this is again not for the UE operation. But if history teaches us anything, it's that all the words of the US Federal Reserve are always the same lie. Look at their actions. What the US Federal Reserve is saying and doing now is a signal that something is wrong on Wall Street. Maybe problems with the repo market are brewing again. Maybe there are other problems in the bond markets. We see that bond auctions are going badly, and the Fed is starting to come in and buy some of these securities. This means that the market does not want to buy us debt under current conditions and in current circumstances. And in order to prevent the auctions from failing, the US Federal Reserve is already intervening and buying bonds itself through the so-called SOMA. In fact, this is already quantitative easing, only hidden. They don't recognize him yet, just as they didn't recognize him in 2019. I saw an interesting post from DeCostal magazine, in which he wrote, breaking news. The Fed bought bonds for $14 and $8 billion today and another $20 billion yesterday. In other words, in general, in 2 days, the US Federal Reserve has already poured $34.8 billion into the bond market. These are the largest purchases of these securities by the federal system since 2021 year. And this is related to the bond auction. Maybe if they had not bought these bonds, the auction would not have been so successful. And Treasury bond yields would have risen sharply and very much. So, apparently, it's still more about bonds than the repo market. But that's why you need to watch with a repo screensaver, because if it grows sharply, the US Federal Reserve will have to intervene with even larger amounts, which, of course, will favorably affect the same Bitcoin, which loves liquidity very much. So far, the US Federal Reserve is trying to monetize these debts, as we see, and there are too many debts in the system. At the beginning of the video, I said that this year alone, they will need to pay off debts of $9 and $2 trillion. And the cost of financing the debt continues to grow. And the finance minister is infuriating, closely monitoring yields, and the US Federal Reserve, without lowering rates, is trying to keep yields with the help of so-called certain operations. Now the US Federal Reserve publishes data on its balance sheet status only on the 30th of April. And, as we have seen earlier, they began to conduct some operations here in September 2019. They stubbornly said that they did not spend to UE, but in the end, after 6 months, their balance began to explode and grew from $4 trillion to almost $9 trillion in just 2 years. And I think we can see a similar story this time. We are already seeing talk of non-Q operations, and, perhaps, 6 months after that, and maybe even earlier, within 6 months, the US Federal Reserve will switch to the mode of direct, undisguised and large-scale quantitative easing. And do you know how this has affected Bitcoin in the past? He went into a huge growth. And do you know how this has affected alt-Bitcoins in the past? They have gone into huge growth. All of this can happen if the historical analogy repeats. That's it. See you in the new videos. See you soon.